The grand chandelier shimmered over the luxurious ballroom, where men in tailored suits discussed fortunes, mergers, and stock prices. Ethan Sinclair, the billionaire CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, stood among them, tall, powerful, untouchable. He was known for his genius in business, his cold detachment, and most infamously, his bizarre condition, a rare allergy that made physical contact with any woman unbearable. A single touch triggered painful rashes, swelling, and in extreme cases, dangerous reactions. It wasn't always this way. Once, long ago, he had been normal until something happened that changed everything. The media speculated wildly. Some said it was psychological, others whispered about a cruel betrayal. But Ethan never spoke about it. He had built walls around himself, both emotionally and physically, ruling his empire from a distance. "Sir, everything is set for your meeting with the investors tomorrow," his assistant, Leo, said, standing a few feet away as they exited the event. "Shall I arrange for the new cleaning staff to be briefed on your floor's special protocol?" Ethan barely glanced up. "Just make sure they don't mess up. I don't need anyone invading my space." His penthouse was a fortress. Every employee was male, security, chefs, assistants, even the cleaning crew. No woman had stepped foot into his personal world in years. But that night, fate had other plans. As he arrived home, exhausted, he noticed a faint scent, something unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. His sharp eyes darted toward the kitchen. A woman stood there, wiping the counter, completely unaware of his presence. She wasn't dressed in a sleek uniform like his usual staff. Instead, she wore a simple sweater, her hair tied back in a loose bun. Something about her seemed different. His pulse quickened, his body tensed. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. The woman turned abruptly, startled. Her wide, nervous eyes locked onto his. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered. "I didn't mean to be in your space. I was just finishing up." Ethan clenched his fists. His skin crawled just at the thought of her being this close. "Who let you in? Do you have any idea what happens if—" "I know," she interrupted softly. "Your allergy. The manager told me. I was told to clean when you're not around, but I lost track of time." His jaw tightened. His breath was uneven, his nerves on edge. He should have thrown her out immediately, but for some reason he didn't. For the first time in years, a woman had entered his world. And strangely, he wasn't running. Ethan took a step back, his pulse hammering in his ears. His body was already preparing for the worst. Itching, burning, swelling. But nothing happened. No reaction. No pain. No allergic flare-up. His mind raced. That was impossible. Every doctor, every test, every incident in the past had confirmed the same thing. His body rejected any physical proximity to a woman. And yet, this cleaning lady stood barely a few feet away, her presence like a quiet storm in his perfectly controlled world. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. I should go." Ethan snapped out of his trance. "Yes, you should." His voice was clipped, but there was something else beneath it. Something that hadn't been there before. Confusion, curiosity, a sliver of something he didn't want to name. She nodded quickly and turned to leave, but before she could disappear, he called out, "What's your name?" She hesitated, then glanced back at him.
Isla. Isla.
The name lingered in the air as she hurried away, leaving behind only the faint trace of lavender and lemon, a scent that felt oddly soothing. That night, Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the security footage of his penthouse. He fast-forwarded through hours of recordings until he found her. Moving through his space, cleaning with quiet efficiency, completely unaware of the world around her. She didn't snoop, didn't linger unnecessarily, didn't seem fascinated by his wealth like most people were. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Why didn't she trigger his allergy? The next morning, Leo entered his office with a folder in hand. "Sir, there's an issue. The cleaning agency mistakenly sent Isla instead of the regular staff. It won't happen again." Ethan tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. "Sir." A long pause. Then his own voice surprised him. "Don't replace her." Leo blinked. Excuse me?" "You heard me," Ethan said, his voice firmer this time. "She stays." Leo hesitated but nodded. "Understood. I'll make sure she follows the usual rules." Ethan didn't respond. His mind was still stuck on one thought, something that unsettled him more than anything had in years. For the first time, a woman had entered his world, and for some reason, he wanted to see her again. The next few days passed in an odd, unfamiliar rhythm. Isla came and went like a shadow, careful never to overstep, never to invade his space. Yet, Ethan found himself more aware of her presence than he had ever been of anyone before. She moved with quiet grace, her footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floors. Unlike others, she didn't seem fascinated by his wealth. She didn't sneak glances at the priceless art on the walls or marvel at the breathtaking skyline view from his penthouse. She simply did her job, efficient, precise, and different. And most unsettling of all, his body didn't reject her. Ethan tested it in subtle ways. He'd walk closer than necessary when she was dusting a shelf. He'd watch her reflection in the glass windows, waiting for his skin to itch, for his throat to tighten. But nothing ever happened. It made no sense. One evening, as he was reviewing contracts in his study, a faint sound reached his ears. A soft hum. He frowned. Setting his papers aside, he followed the sound until he reached the kitchen. Isla stood with her back to him, wiping down the counters, humming an old tune under her breath. It was low, almost like a whisper, but it stirred something in him, a distant memory he couldn't quite place. She turned, and the moment she saw him, she froze. I'm sorry," she stammered, quickly grabbing her cleaning supplies. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Ethan leaned against the doorway, studying her. "What was that song?" She hesitated, as if unsure whether to answer. "Just something my mother used to sing." Something about the way she said it, the way her voice softened, the way a shadow flickered across her face, made him ask, "Where is she now?" Isla looked down. Gone. The single word carried more weight than an entire conversation. Ethan didn't respond right away. He knew loss, far more than he ever let anyone see. And for a brief moment, the space between them wasn't filled with silence, but with something else, something unspoken. Then, without another word, she turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, her shoulder brushed lightly against his arm. Ethan's breath caught. No pain, no reaction, just warmth. He didn't move as she walked away, but inside, something shifted. His allergy had controlled his life for years. Women had been an untouchable force in his world. But now, for the first time, he wondered if it had all been a lie. If Isla was proof of something he never dared to believe. Ethan found himself watching Isla more than he intended to. Not in the way he observed business deals or analyzed stock trends, but in a way that unsettled him, curious, drawn in, unable to explain why. She was nothing like the women he knew. They wore diamonds and designer gowns. She wore a simple uniform. They laughed too loudly at his jokes. She barely spoke unless necessary. They looked at him like he was a prize to be won. She barely looked at him at all. And yet, she was the only one who had ever touched him without consequence. One night, long after the city had gone quiet, Ethan stood in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass. His mind raced with questions that had no answers. Was it psychological? Some kind of subconscious block? Or had the doctors been wrong all along? He needed to know. The next morning, he called Leo into his office. "Get my medical team here. Today." Leo hesitated. "Sir, is something wrong?" "Just do it." Hours later, Ethan sat in his private clinic, surrounded by his top physicians. They ran test after test, injecting, scanning, measuring his reactions. He let them poke and prod, but his mind was focused on one thing, Isla. Finally, Dr. Reynolds, his lead physician, cleared his throat. "Ethan, we've reviewed everything thoroughly. Your allergy is still present." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then why is there one exception?" The doctor exchanged a cautious glance with his team. Biologically, it doesn't make sense. There's no known case of someone being allergic to an entire gender except for one individual. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then why? Dr. Reynolds hesitated, then said carefully, allergies aren't just physical. Sometimes the body reacts to what the mind believes to be true. Ethan stilled. You're saying this is psychological? I'm saying your body has been conditioned to reject women. But for some reason, Isla bypasses that response. The doctor adjusted his glasses. If you want answers, you don't need a medical team. You need to ask yourself why her. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He had built his entire life around control of his empire, his emotions, his weaknesses. But now, control was slipping. At 2 a.m., unable to shake the questions in his mind, he left his bedroom and walked into the dimly lit living room. And there, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, was Isla. She gasped when she saw him, quickly sitting up. I was just resting for a moment. I didn't mean... Stay? Ethan said, surprising even himself. She blinked. What? Stay? He repeated, softer this time. Just for a moment. She hesitated, then nodded, pulling the blanket closer. Ethan sat in the chair across from her, studying her in the quiet of the night. After a long silence, he finally asked, why do I feel nothing when I'm near you?
Isla frowned.
Nothing. No pain. No reaction. His voice was quieter now. Why you? She stared at him, confusion and something else flickering in her eyes. I don't know, she admitted. Ethan wasn't sure what he expected, but for the first time in years, he didn't care about answers. He just wanted her to stay, and that terrified him. Ethan had spent his life avoiding touch, avoiding closeness. But now, all he could think about was the way Isla existed in his world so effortlessly, as if she had always belonged there. Days passed, and something shifted between them. It wasn't spoken, wasn't acknowledged, but it was there. In the way Ethan lingered in rooms she cleaned, in the way her eyes softened when she caught him watching. She still kept her distance, still treated him like the untouchable CEO the world saw him as. But Ethan knew better now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, he found her in the library, reaching for a book on the highest shelf. Without thinking, he stepped forward and plucked it from the ledge, handing it to her before she could protest. Her fingers brushed against his. He didn't pull away, neither did she. For a long moment, they stood there, the quiet air between them heavier than words. Isla swallowed hard. Mr. Carter, Ethan. His voice was barely a whisper. Just, Ethan. She exhaled shakily. Ethan. Something about the way she said his name sent a pulse of warmth through his chest. He didn't understand it, didn't know why it felt so different from the countless times women had spoken his name before. But with her, it wasn't about his wealth, his power, his status. It was just him. She stepped back suddenly, creating space between them. I should go. Ethan's jaw tightened. He should have let her. He should have gone back to the man he was before she walked into his life. But he was tired of should-haves. Before he could stop himself, he said, Why do you look at me like that? She hesitated, gripping the book tightly. Like what? Like I'm more than what the world sees. Isla's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Because you are. His chest tightened. You don't even know me. She smiled sadly. Maybe not. But I see you. Ethan wasn't sure which was worse, knowing she would never belong in his world, or realizing that he desperately wanted her to. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind was a battlefield of emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. He needed to know more, needed to understand why she was different. The next morning, he asked Leo to look into her background. But when the results came back, Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Because Isla wasn't who she claimed to be, and the truth would change everything. Ethan didn't know what to feel when Leo handed him the file. It was thick, official-looking, and heavy with secrets. For the first time, he hesitated. Part of him didn't want to know. He had felt something real, something raw with Isla, something that had made him question every lie he had told himself about relationships and human connection. But now, the truth sat in front of him like a looming storm. He opened the file.
Isla Rivera.
Born to a poor family in the outskirts of the city. Her father, a mechanic, died in a car accident when she was just a child. Her mother had struggled, working multiple jobs to keep her and her younger brother afloat. There were traces of hardship in her history, but nothing that could explain the undeniable bond Ethan felt when she was near. But the deeper he went into the file, the more unsettling details surfaced. Isla had been living under a false name. Her real name was Amelia Carter. The blood in Ethan's veins ran cold. Amelia Carter. The name echoed through his mind like a bomb. He dropped the file, his heart pounding in his chest. How was this possible? Was she a relative? A long-lost family member he had never known about? The idea felt absurd, but the more he read, the clearer it became. Isla was not who she seemed. She had been hiding something, and that something was a connection to him. Desperately, he called Leo. Get her in here. Now. Leo arrived minutes later, his expression one of concern. Is everything okay, sir? Where is she? Ethan snapped, barely holding his composure. Leo hesitated, but then nodded. She's in the laundry room, cleaning up. Ethan didn't wait for another word. He stormed toward the laundry room, his heart racing. He couldn't understand why his chest felt so tight. Couldn't understand why the thought of confronting her left him trembling. When he reached the door, he paused, taking a deep breath. Then he pushed it open. Isla looked up in surprise, her eyes widening when she saw him. Ethan, what's wrong? Without saying a word, Ethan stepped inside, holding up the file. What is this? Why did you lie to me?
Isla froze.
The color drained from her face. For the first time, the calm facade she had always worn cracked, revealing the raw vulnerability underneath. She began, her voice trembling, but the words failed her. Ethan's voice was low, edged with pain. You're not just a cleaning lady, are you? You're Amelia Carter, aren't you? Why are you hiding from me? She took a step back, tears welling up in her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for this to happen. His mind raced. Why? Why pretend to be someone else? Why hide from me? Isla swallowed hard, her eyes filled with anguish. Because I was running. From the truth, from my past, from my family. My real name brought too much pain, too many expectations. I had to start over. Ethan's world tilted. Amelia Carter was the name of his estranged sister, the one he had not seen in years. She had disappeared from his life without a trace. And now, here she was, the woman who had somehow slipped into his life without him knowing. He shook his head, struggling to grasp the magnitude of the truth. You were my sister all along? Isla, or rather, Amelia, nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to be the person I was. I didn't want to burden you. I wanted to be someone new. The silence between them was suffocating. Every part of Ethan's body wanted to pull away, to reject the overwhelming flood of emotions crashing through him. But he couldn't. He couldn't turn away from her. She was family. She was the one woman he had never expected to feel anything for. And yet, here she was, standing before him in her vulnerability, her honesty. The room felt smaller, the weight of everything pressing in on him. He was no longer sure what the right thing was to do. But one thing was certain, whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. And in that moment, he didn't know whether to reach for her or walk away forever. But he knew one thing. The truth had come crashing into his life, and now, neither of them could run from it.